The day my father threw me out of the house, it was raining. I remember that detail with perfect, painful clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes from moments that change your life forever. The rain was not a gentle, soft rain, the kind that patters against the windows and makes you want to curl up with a book. It was a hard, driving, unforgiving rain, the kind that soaks through your clothes in seconds and makes the world feel cold and hostile and indifferent to your suffering. I stood on the front porch of the house where I had lived for all 19 years of my life, my thin jacket already saturated, my hair plastered to my forehead, water dripping into my eyes and mixing with tears I was too proud to acknowledge. Behind me, the heavy oak door had just been slammed with a force that shook the frame. In front of me, the long gravel driveway stretched into the darkness, leading away from everything I had ever known. My father's last words were still ringing in my ears, echoing in the silence that followed the slam of the door. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer my son. Don't come back. You're dead to me." He had shouted them, his face red with rage, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes blazing with a fury I had never seen before. And then he had slammed the door, and the sound of it was like a gunshot, a final, irrevocable punctuation mark on the sentence of my childhood. I was no longer his son. I was dead to him. Because I had told him that I wanted to be a doctor instead of taking over the family construction business. Because I had chosen my own path instead of the one he had laid out for me before I was even born. Because I had dared to want something different for my life. My mother stood on the other side of the door, her face visible through the small window set into the wood. She was crying, her cheeks wet with tears, her hands pressed flat against the glass as if she could somehow reach through it and pull me back inside. Her lips were moving, forming words I couldn't hear over the storm. "I'm sorry. I love you. Come back. Please come back." But she didn't open the door. She had never defied my father, not once in their 30 years of marriage, and she wasn't going to start now. She was a gentle woman, a kind woman, a woman who had spent her entire life trying to keep the peace between a stubborn husband and a headstrong son. But she didn't have the strength to stand up to him. She never had. After a few moments, she stepped away from the window, her face dissolving into the darkness of the house, and I was alone. I walked down the gravel driveway with nothing but a backpack full of clothes, a single envelope containing the $500 I had saved from my part-time job at the hardware store, and a heart full of anger and grief and the desperate, burning determination to prove my father wrong. I didn't look back. I was too proud, too hurt, too full of the righteous fury of a teenager who had been wronged by a parent who refused to understand him. I just put one foot in front of the other, walking through the rain and the darkness, heading toward the highway that would take me away from this town and this life and this family. I hitchhiked to the city, a 4-hour journey in the back of a truck driven by a kind-faced man named George who didn't ask any questions but kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror with an expression of gentle concern. He dropped me off at a truck stop on the outskirts of the city, pressed a $20 bill into my hand despite my protests, and told me to take care of myself. I never saw him again, but I have never forgotten his kindness. In a world that had just shown me how cruel it could be, he was a reminder that there was still goodness in it. I found a cheap motel room in a neighborhood that smelled of garbage and exhaust fumes and desperation. The room was small and dingy, with a lumpy mattress, a television that didn't work, and a water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of some forgotten continent. I lay on the bed in my wet clothes, staring at that stain, and I wondered if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. I was 19 years old. I had no money, no connections, no plan beyond the vague, audacious dream of becoming a doctor. I had just been disowned by my father and abandoned, however unwillingly, by my mother. I was completely, utterly alone in the world. And yet, beneath the fear and the grief and the anger, there was a tiny spark of something else, something that felt almost like hope. I had made a choice, a terrifying, irreversible, life-altering choice, and now I had to live with it. The years that followed were the hardest of my life, but they also forged me into the person I am today. I worked 2 jobs to pay for my education, waiting tables at a diner during the day and cleaning offices at night. The diner was called Mabel's, a greasy spoon with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that only played songs from the 1960s. The owner, a woman named Mabel herself, was a grandmotherly figure with a sharp tongue and a kind heart, and she took a liking to me for reasons I never fully understood. She let me eat for free, let me study during slow shifts, let me cry in the back room on the anniversary of the day my father threw me out. She never asked questions. She just kept my coffee cup full and told me I was going to make something of myself someday. The cleaning job was at a medical office building downtown, a sterile, fluorescent-lit complex where I pushed a mop and emptied trash cans and scrubbed toilets until my hands were raw. It was not glamorous work, but it gave me something I desperately needed: access. I got to know the doctors who worked in the building, got to watch them from a distance, got to imagine myself in their shoes someday. One of them, a cardiologist named Dr. Patel, noticed me reading a medical textbook during my break one night. He was working late, coming out of his office with a cup of coffee in his hand, and he stopped when he saw what I was reading. "You're interested in medicine?" he asked, his voice curious but not condescending. "I want to be a doctor," I said, and the words felt audacious coming from a janitor in stained coveralls. "I'm saving money for medical school." Dr. Patel looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Come to my office tomorrow morning," he said. "I might be able to help you." That conversation changed my life. Dr. Patel became my mentor, my advocate, my lifeline. He helped me apply for scholarships I didn't know existed. He wrote me letters of recommendation that glowed with praise. He let me shadow him during his rounds, explaining procedures and diagnoses with the patience of a natural teacher. Without him, I would never have made it through the grueling years of medical school and residency. He was the father I needed when my own father had abandoned me. I attended classes at the state university during the day, sitting in the front row of every lecture hall, taking notes until my hand cramped into a claw. I studied in the library until the librarians kicked me out at closing time, and then I went back to my tiny studio apartment and studied some more. The apartment was barely bigger than a closet, with a hot plate instead of a stove and a shower that never got hotter than lukewarm. But it was mine, and it was the first step on the path I had chosen. I didn't have friends. I didn't have a social life. I didn't have family. I had a goal, and I clung to it with a ferocity that surprised even me. Every time I wanted to give up, every time the exhaustion and the loneliness threatened to overwhelm me, I thought about my father's face on the night he threw me out. The rage in his eyes. The finality of his words. "You're dead to me." And I used that memory as fuel. I would prove him wrong. I would become a doctor. I would succeed despite him, not because of him. Medical school was even harder than I had imagined. The debt was crushing, a mountain of loans that grew larger every semester. The hours were brutal, 80-hour weeks of classes and labs and clinical rotations that left me dizzy with exhaustion. The competition was relentless, a constant, grinding pressure to be smarter and faster and better than everyone around me. But I had spent 4 years building myself into someone who could endure anything, and I endured this too. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, and I matched into a residency program in cardiothoracic surgery at one of the best hospitals in the country. The day I got the acceptance letter, I sat in my apartment and cried for the first time since my father threw me out. Not tears of sadness, tears of vindication. I had done it. I had become a doctor, and I had done it without him. I met my wife Elena during my second year of residency. She was a nurse in the cardiac unit, a woman with warm brown eyes and a laugh that could fill a room, and a way of looking at me that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. She was assigned to assist me during a complicated bypass surgery, and I was immediately struck by her competence, her confidence, the way she moved through the operating room with a grace that seemed almost choreographed. But it was after the surgery, in the break room, that I really noticed her. She was drinking terrible hospital coffee and laughing at something another nurse had said, and the sound of her laugh went through me like a current of electricity. She pursued me, which was a good thing because I was too emotionally stunted to pursue her. It took her 2 years to convince me to go on a date with her, And it took another year for me to let down my walls enough to let her truly know me. I had spent so long protecting myself, so long keeping people at a distance, that I had forgotten how to let anyone in. But Elena was patient. She was so patient. She chipped away at my defenses with kindness and humor and a stubborn refusal to give up on me. And eventually, I told her everything. About my father, about the rain, about the slammed door, about the 12 years of silence. She listened without interrupting, her brown eyes full of compassion. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What would you do if you saw him again?" I had been asking myself that question for years, and I still didn't have a good answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've imagined it 1,000 times. Sometimes I imagine confronting him, showing him everything I've accomplished, forcing him to acknowledge that he was wrong about me. Sometimes I imagine saying nothing at all, just looking at him and walking away, the way he walked away from me. And sometimes, in my weaker moments, I imagine forgiving him. But I don't know if I have that in me. I don't know if I'm capable of it." Elena took my hand, her fingers warm and steady. "Forgiveness isn't about whether he deserves it," she said quietly. "It's about whether you deserve to be free of the weight you're carrying. You've been carrying your father's rejection for a long time, David. More than a decade. That's a long time to hold on to something so heavy." I didn't have an answer to that. I didn't know if I ever would. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was in my office at the hospital, a sleek, glass-walled room with a view of the city skyline, reviewing the charts for a triple bypass surgery I was scheduled to perform that afternoon. My career had flourished beyond anything I could have imagined when I was a 19-year-old kid hitchhiking to the city in the rain. I was one of the top cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, with a reputation for taking on cases that other doctors considered hopeless. I had saved hundreds of lives. I had built a career that was the envy of my peers. I had everything I had ever wanted, and I had done it all without my father. My phone rang, the caller ID displaying a number I didn't recognize with an area code from my hometown. I almost didn't answer. I was busy. I had a surgery to prepare for. I didn't have time for unknown callers. But something made me pick up the phone. Some instinct, some premonition, some whisper of fate. "Dr. Marcus?" a voice said. A woman's voice, familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. "Dr. David Marcus, is this you?" "This is Dr. Marcus," I said carefully, my pen hovering over the chart I had been reviewing. "Who is this?" "It's Margaret," the voice said, and suddenly the familiarity resolved into recognition. Margaret Hennessy, my mother's best friend, the woman who had lived next door to us for my entire childhood. She had been like an aunt to me, always slipping me extra cookies when my parents weren't looking, always asking about my grades and my friends and my dreams. "Margaret Hennessy, David. I'm so sorry to call you like this. I've been trying to find you for weeks. Your mother told me where you were, years ago, before she passed. I kept the information, hoping I'd never need to use it." My mother had known where I was. The revelation hit me harder than I expected. She had known where I was, and she had never reached out. She had kept my location a secret, and she had died without ever seeing me again. The grief of that, the complicated, tangled grief, threatened to overwhelm me. But I pushed it down, the way I had learned to push down all my difficult emotions, and I focused on the present. "What's going on, Margaret? Why are you calling me?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you the next words are going to be bad. "It's your father," she said finally. "He's very sick, David. He's been in congestive heart failure for over a year. The doctors at the local hospital have done everything they can, but he's getting worse. He's been moved to University Medical Center for evaluation. They're saying he needs a heart transplant, and the waiting list is so long. He doesn't have much time." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My father, the man who had thrown me out of his house, the man who had told me I was dead to him, the man I had spent 12 years trying to prove wrong. He was dying. He needed a heart transplant. And Margaret was calling me because I was a cardiac surgeon, because I had connections, because I might be able to help. "I don't know what you expect me to do," I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended, colder. "He made it very clear that I'm not his son. He threw me out. He told me never to come back. He said I was dead to him. Why would he want my help now? Why would I give it? Margaret was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, gentler, the voice of a woman who had known me since I was in diapers and who understood exactly how much pain I was carrying. He never stopped loving you, David. I know you don't believe that. I know it's easier to believe that he was just a cold, heartless man who didn't care about you. But that's not the truth. The truth is more complicated. Your mother told me things before she died. She told me that your father kept every newspaper clipping about you. Every time your name appeared in the local paper for some achievement, some award, some milestone, he cut it out and saved it. He has a whole drawer full of them in his study. He never threw a single one away. I closed my eyes, trying to process what she was telling me. The image of my father, the man who had thrown me out of his house and told me I was dead to him, carefully cutting out newspaper articles about my life and saving them in a drawer, was so incongruous that my mind couldn't fully grasp it. It didn't match the narrative I had constructed, the story I had told myself for 12 years. In my story, my father was a monster, a villain, a man who had rejected his own son without a second thought. But Margaret was telling me a different story. A story about a man who was too proud to apologize, but who had never stopped caring. A story about a man who had followed my career from a distance, who had been proud of me in secret, who had never stopped thinking of me as his son. Why didn't he ever reach out? I asked finally. If he was so proud of me, if he kept all those clippings, why didn't he ever call? Why didn't he ever write? Why didn't he ever apologize? Because he's a stubborn, proud, foolish man, Margaret said, and there was a mixture of affection and exasperation in her voice. He was wrong, David. He knows he was wrong. He's known it for years. But he didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to pick up the phone and say the words. He was raised by a father who never apologized for anything, who believed that admitting fault was a sign of weakness. Your father tried to be different, but in the end, he fell into the same patterns. He let his pride get in the way of his love. And now he's dying, and he's too proud to ask for your help, even though you're probably the only person in the world who can save him. The only person in the world who can save him. The words echoed in my mind, heavy with irony. I had become a doctor to save lives, to heal the sick, to make a difference in the world. And now the man who had rejected me, the man who had told me I was dead to him, needed me to save his life. It was almost too much to process. I told Margaret I would think about it, which was a lie. What I meant was that I would try to forget she had called. I would try to push the whole thing back into the box where it had been living for 12 years. I would try to go back to my life, my career, my wife, and pretend that nothing had changed. But I couldn't do it. The call had cracked something open inside me, a door I had kept locked for more than a decade, and I couldn't close it again. That night, I told Elena what had happened. We were sitting on the couch in our living room, the one with the view of the city lights, and she listened in silence as I poured out the whole story. The phone call from Margaret. My father's illness. The impossible choice I was being asked to make. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me wants to do nothing. To let him face the consequences of his choices, just like I had to face the consequences of mine. He threw me out. He cut me off. He doesn't get to come crawling back now that he needs something from me. And the other part? Elena asked gently. I was silent for a long time, staring at the city lights through the window. Then I said, very quietly, "The other part remembers that he's my father. Despite everything. Despite the rain and the slammed door and the 12 years of silence. He's still my father. And I became a doctor to save lives. How can I call myself a healer if I let my own father die because I'm too angry to help him?" Elena reached over and took my hand, her fingers warm and steady. "Then you already know what you have to do," she said. "The question isn't whether you should help him. The question is whether you're ready to face him." I flew to my hometown the next day, taking a leave of absence from the hospital that I had not taken in years. The flight was short, barely 2 hours, but it felt like a journey across a lifetime. Every mile that passed beneath the plane was a mile closer to the past I had tried so hard to escape. I had not been back since the night I left, and the thought of returning filled me with a dread I couldn't fully articulate. What would it feel like to walk those streets again? To see the house where I had grown up? To face the man who had thrown me out? University Medical Center was a sprawling complex of glass and steel on the edge of the city, a world away from the small local hospital where my father had been treated initially. I found his room on the fourth floor, in the cardiac care unit. The nurse at the station recognized my name, her eyes widening slightly when she realized who I was. Dr. David Marcus, the renowned cardiothoracic surgeon, here to see a patient. Word traveled fast in hospitals, and I knew that within hours, the entire cardiac unit would know that I was here and why. I stood outside my father's room for a long moment, my heart pounding, my palms slick with sweat. The door was closed, a blank, white door like every other door in the hallway. But it felt like a portal to another world, a world I had spent 12 years trying to forget. I could walk away. I could turn around right now, go back to the airport, fly home to my wife and my career and my carefully constructed life. No one would blame me. No one would judge me. After everything he had done, I had every right to refuse. But I didn't walk away. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My father was asleep. He was propped up in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and 4 lines and the quiet, rhythmic beeping of machines that were keeping him alive. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, and the only light came from the glow of the monitors and a small lamp on the bedside table. I moved closer, my footsteps silent on the linoleum floor, and I looked at the man I had not seen in 12 years. He looked nothing like the man who had thrown me out of the house. That man had been broad-shouldered and powerful, a construction worker who had spent his life building things with his hands, a man whose physical presence had dominated every room he entered. This man was thin and pale and diminished, his skin gray and papery, his breathing labored even in sleep. His hands, which had once been so strong they could lift beams and hammer nails for hours without tiring, lay limp at his sides, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the fingers trembling slightly. Tubes and wires connected him to the machines that were doing the work his failing heart could no longer do on its own. He looked old. He looked broken. He looked like he was already halfway gone. I stood by his bed, looking down at him, and I felt a rush of emotions so complex and so contradictory that I couldn't begin to untangle them. Anger, still, after all these years, a hot, familiar flame that had never completely gone out. Grief, for the relationship we had never had, for the years we had lost, for the father I had needed and the father I had gotten instead. Pity, for the man who had thrown away his only son because of pride and stubbornness, a man who was now dying alone in a hospital bed with no one to hold his hand. And beneath all of it, buried so deep I could barely acknowledge it, there was love. A stubborn, painful, unwanted love that had survived 12 years of silence and rejection. A love that I had tried to kill and had never succeeded in extinguishing. His eyes opened. For a moment, he just stared at me, his gaze unfocused and confused, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. His eyes were the same color I remembered, a deep, dark brown, but they were clouded now, dimmed by illness and age. Then recognition dawned, spreading across his face like the sun breaking through clouds. His expression went through a rapid series of changes, shock first, his mouth opening slightly, his eyes widening. Then disbelief, as if he thought he might be hallucinating. Then shame, a deep, bone-deep shame that seemed to shrink him even further into the bed. And finally, something that looked almost like hope. A fragile, tentative hope, the hope of a man who had long ago given up expecting anything good to happen to him. "David," he whispered, his voice raspy and weak, barely audible over the hum of the machines. "David, you came. After all this time, you actually came." I didn't move closer. I didn't take his hand. I stood at the foot of his bed, my arms crossed over my chest, my face carefully neutral. "I didn't come for you," I said, and the words were harsher than I intended, sharper than I wanted them to be. They were the words of the angry teenager I had been, not the successful surgeon I had become. But I couldn't seem to stop them. "I came because Margaret called me. She said you were dying. She said you needed a heart transplant. She begged me to help. So here I am." My father closed his eyes, and a tear slipped down his cheek, a single tear that traced a path through the lines and wrinkles on his face before disappearing into the stubble on his jaw. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, David. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. I should never have thrown you out. I should never have said those things. I should have supported you. I should have been proud of you for wanting to be a doctor. I should have been a better father." The words I had been waiting 12 years to hear. The apology I had imagined in 1,000 different versions, none of which had ever felt satisfying enough to ease the pain. In my fantasies, the apology was always accompanied by some grand gesture, some dramatic demonstration of remorse that would make everything right. But there was nothing grand or dramatic about this. Just a dying man in a hospital bed, crying and saying the words he should have said a decade ago. And it didn't feel satisfying at all. It just felt sad. Profoundly, heartbreakingly sad. "You kept newspaper clippings about me," I said, and my voice cracked on the words despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Margaret told me. You saved articles about my achievements. All these years, you were following my career, cutting out articles, saving them in a drawer. Why? Why would you do that and never reach out to me? It doesn't make any sense." My father opened his eyes and looked at me, his gaze clearer now, more focused. "Because I was ashamed," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I knew I was wrong the moment you walked out the door. I knew it, and I wanted to call you back, but my pride wouldn't let me. And then the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years. And every year that passed made it harder and harder to pick up the phone. I told myself you were better off without me. I told myself you didn't want to hear from me. I told myself 100 different lies to justify my cowardice." He paused, struggling to catch his breath. "But I never stopped being proud of you. I never stopped loving you. You're my son. You'll always be my son. And I am so sorry that it took me dying to finally tell you that." I stood there, frozen, while my father wept. The machines beeped steadily, indifferent to the emotional storm happening in the room. Outside the window, the world went about its business, cars driving by, people walking on the sidewalk, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But in this small, dim hospital room, everything had changed. The wall I had built around my heart, the wall that had protected me for 12 years, was beginning to crumble. I thought about Elena, about what she had said. Forgiveness isn't about whether he deserves it. It's about whether you deserve to be free of the weight you're carrying. I had been carrying my father's rejection for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. It had become part of me, woven into the fabric of my identity. I was the son who had been thrown out. I was the boy who had been told he was dead to his father. I was the man who had succeeded despite everything, who had proven them all wrong. That story had defined me for 12 years. But it was a heavy story, a painful story, and I was exhausted from carrying it. "I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon," I said finally, my voice quieter now, less harsh. "One of the best in the country. I've dedicated my entire career to saving lives. I can't perform your transplant myself. There are ethical rules about operating on family members. But I know the best transplant surgeons in this country. I can make sure you get the best care possible. I can advocate for you. I can be here for you." I paused, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. "But I need you to understand something. This doesn't erase what happened. This doesn't make everything okay. 12 years is a long time, and we can't get those years back. You hurt me in ways that I'm still trying to heal from. But you're my father. And despite everything, despite the rain and the slammed door and the years of silence, I'm not going to let you die if I can do something to save you." My father looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was gratitude. Pure, uncomplicated, overwhelming gratitude. The gratitude of a man who had been given a gift he knew he didn't deserve. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Thank you, David. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you. But thank you." "No," I agreed, and a small, sad smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "You don't deserve it. But that's not what this is about." In the weeks that followed, I did everything in my power to help my father. I called in favors from colleagues I had known for years. some of whom owed me for surgeries I had covered or consults I had provided. I pushed for expedited testing, arguing with hospital administrators and insurance companies until my voice was hoarse. I reviewed his medical records with the meticulous attention to detail that had made me one of the best surgeons in my field, identifying potential complications and advocating for treatment plans that would give him the best possible chance of survival. I made sure he was placed as high on the transplant list as his condition warranted, which was very high indeed. And I visited him every day, sitting by his bed for hours at a time, talking to him about my life, my wife, my work, the grandchildren he had never met. And slowly, painfully, awkwardly, we began to rebuild something that resembled a relationship. It was not easy. There were moments of tension, moments when old angers flared up, moments when the wounds of the past threatened to reopen. But we pushed through them. We talked about things we had never talked about before. We talked about the night of the rainstorm, about the words that had been said and the words that should have been said instead. We talked about my mother, who had died 4 years earlier from a sudden stroke. I had not known. I had been so disconnected from my family that I hadn't even known my own mother had died. The guilt of that was overwhelming, a crushing weight that settled on my chest and made it hard to breathe. But my father didn't let me wallow in it. "She knew you loved her," he said quietly. "She never blamed you for leaving. She blamed me. We both did. She would be so proud of you, David. So proud of the man you've become." She used to say, every night before she went to bed, she used to say a prayer for you. A prayer that you were safe, that you were happy, that you were doing what you loved. She never stopped believing in you. Neither did I. I told him about Elena, about how we had met in the cardiac unit, about how she had slowly chipped away at the walls I had built around myself. I told him about our wedding, a small ceremony in a park with just a few friends and colleagues. I showed him pictures on my phone, pictures of our house, pictures of our garden, pictures of the life I had built without him. And he looked at every single one, his eyes hungry for details, for proof that his son had turned out okay despite everything he had done. "It's a good life," he said one afternoon, after I had shown him a photo of Elena and me standing in front of the little house we had bought, our arms around each other, our faces flushed with happiness. "You built a good life, David. A beautiful life. I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. I just never had the courage to tell you." "I wish you had told me 12 years ago," I said quietly. "I wish I had too," he replied, his voice thick with regret. "I wish a lot of things. But wishing doesn't change the past. All we can do is try to do better in the future. If I have a future." "You have a future," I said firmly. "I'm going to make sure of it." The call came on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after I had first arrived. I was at my hotel, a modest place near the hospital, when my phone rang. It was the transplant coordinator, her voice urgent but controlled. A heart had become available. A young man, only 22 years old, had died in a car accident, and his family had made the incredibly difficult decision to donate his organs. The heart was a match for my father. He was being prepped for surgery at that very moment. I rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. I found my father in the pre-op area, already changed into a surgical gown, surrounded by nurses and anesthesiologists who were checking monitors and adjusting for lines. He looked scared. I could see it in the way his eyes darted around the room, in the way his hands gripped the rails of the gurney so tightly his knuckles were white. But when he saw me push through the doors, his whole face relaxed, and something that looked almost like peace settled over his features. "Dr. Chun is doing the surgery," I told him, referring to the best transplant surgeon in the hospital, a man I had personally recruited from a rival institution 5 years earlier. "I've worked with him for years. He's brilliant, meticulous, one of the finest surgeons I've ever known. You're in the best possible hands." "I know," my father said. "You made sure of that. Margaret told me what you've been doing. Calling in favors, arguing with insurance companies, making sure I got the best care. You didn't have to do any of that. After the way I treated you, you had every right to walk away." "I didn't walk away," I said. "That's not who I am. That's not who you raised me to be." My father reached out and took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for a man in his condition. His skin was cool and papery, but there was a warmth in his touch that I hadn't felt in 12 years. "David," he said, his voice urgent. "I need to say something before I go in there. Just in case I don't come out." "You're going to come out," I said firmly. "Dr. Chun has a success rate that would amaze you. This is a routine procedure for him. You're going to be fine." "I know," he said again. "But I still need to say this. Please, let me say this." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He took a deep breath, the effort visible in the way his chest rose and fell. "I was wrong," he said. "About everything. About you wanting to be a doctor. About the way I treated you. About throwing you out. I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I know that sorry isn't enough to make up for 12 years of silence. But it's all I have. I love you, David. You're the best thing I ever did with my life, and I almost threw you away because I was too stubborn, too proud, too scared to admit that my son was smarter than me, braver than me, better than me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I looked at my father, this man who had once seemed so large and so powerful and so terrifying, and I saw him for what he really was. A flawed, frightened, fallible human being who had made terrible mistakes and was now trying, in the only way he knew how, to make them right. And I realized that my anger, the anger I had been carrying for 12 years, was no longer serving me. It had protected me once, when I was young and vulnerable and alone. But I wasn't that person anymore. I was a successful surgeon, a devoted husband, a man who had built a life that was good and meaningful and full of love. And I didn't need the anger anymore. I could let it go. "I forgive you," I said, and the words felt like a physical weight lifting from my shoulders, a weight I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it was there. "I forgive you, Dad, for everything. Now go let Dr. Chin do his job. I'll be here when you wake up." My father's eyes filled with tears, and he squeezed my hand with all the strength he had left. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, son." The surgery took 6 hours. I spent them in the surgical waiting room, a sterile, uncomfortable space with plastic chairs and a television mounted on the wall that was playing a muted news channel I couldn't focus on. I drank terrible coffee from a vending machine, cup after cup, until my hands were shaking from caffeine and anxiety. I tried to read a medical journal I had brought with me, but the words blurred on the page, refusing to resolve into meaning. I paced the length of the waiting room so many times that I lost count, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor, my mind cycling through every possible complication, every worst-case scenario, every way the surgery could go wrong. I had been on the other side of this equation hundreds of times, the surgeon walking into the waiting room to deliver news to anxious families. I had never fully understood what those families were going through until now. Elena flew in that morning, taking time off work to be with me. She didn't say much when she arrived, just walked into the waiting room and wrapped her arms around me and held on tight. Her presence was a steadying force, an anchor in the storm of anxiety that was threatening to pull me under. She sat with me for all 6 hours, holding my hand, occasionally murmuring words of reassurance that I barely heard but somehow still felt. At one point, she went to the cafeteria and brought back sandwiches, and she made me eat even though I had no appetite. "You can't take care of your father if you don't take care of yourself," she said, and the practical wisdom of a nurse who had seen too many family members neglect their own health during a crisis. At hour 5, the waiting room door opened and Dr. Chen walked in. He was still wearing his surgical scrubs, his mask pulled down around his neck, his hair slightly disheveled from the hours under the surgical cap. His face was tired but calm, and I had been in this business long enough to read the expressions of surgeons coming out of the operating room. A calm face meant good news. A tense face meant complications. A face that avoided eye contact meant the worst possible outcome. Dr. Chin's face was calm. "The surgery went well," he said, and the words hit me like a wave of relief, so powerful it made my knees weak. "The new heart is functioning normally. There were no complications, no unexpected bleeding, no rejection issues. Your father is a strong man, David. He tolerated the procedure better than many patients half his age. He's stable now, and he's being moved to the ICU for recovery. Barring any unforeseen complications, I expect him to make a full recovery. I sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Elena was beside me in an instant, her arm around my shoulders, her voice soft in my ear. "He's okay," she was saying. "He's going to be okay. You did it, David. You saved him." "Thank you," I said to Dr. Chun, my voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for everything. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Dr. Chun smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You know, David, in all the years I've known you, you've never asked me for a single favor. Not one. And then you show up 3 weeks ago and ask me to take on your father as a patient, and you're calling in markers from every surgeon in the hospital, and you're arguing with the transplant committee like a lawyer cross-examining a witness." He paused, his expression thoughtful. I was curious, so I did some digging. I know the story now, or at least part of it. The falling out, the years of estrangement, the fact that you became one of the best cardiac surgeons in the country without any support from your family. He put his hand on my shoulder. "You're a good man, David. A better man than most. Your father is lucky to have you. And I think, after everything, you're lucky to have him too. Second chances are rare in this life. Don't waste this one." I didn't feel like a good man. I felt like a man who had been carrying a weight for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. But as I walked into the ICU an hour later, Elena by my side, and saw my father lying in the recovery bed, pale and still but alive, connected to machines that beeped with the steady, reassuring rhythm of a healthy heart, I felt something I hadn't felt in 12 years. I felt like a son, not an estranged son, not a rejected son, just a son, standing by his father's bedside, grateful that he was still alive. The recovery was slow and difficult, the way recoveries from major transplant surgery always are. There were setbacks and complications and moments when we weren't sure if my father was going to pull through. There was an infection in the second week, a dangerous fever that spiked in the middle of the night and sent the nurses scrambling for antibiotics. There was a rejection scare in the third week, a moment when the numbers on the monitors started trending in the wrong direction and Dr. Chen had to adjust the immunosuppressant regimen. There were days when my father was too weak to speak, too exhausted to do anything but sleep, and I sat by his bed in silence, watching the monitors, willing his body to keep fighting. But he did keep fighting. Day by day, week by week, he got stronger. The color came back to his face, a faint pink replacing the gray pallor that had been there when I first arrived. The light came back to his eyes, that spark of life that had been dimmed by illness and despair. He started eating solid food again, started sitting up in bed, started taking short, shuffling walks down the hospital corridor with a nurse on one side and me on the other. And something came back to our relationship, something that had been missing for so long I had forgotten it was possible. Trust, connection, a tentative, fragile, but undeniably real love. We talked during those weeks, really talked, in a way we had never talked before. My father told me about his own childhood, about his father who had been even harder and colder than he was, about the cycle of rejection and disappointment that had been passed down through 3 generations of Marcus men. My father never told me he loved me. He said one afternoon, his voice still weak, but gaining strength every day. Not once. Not when I graduated from high school, not when I got married, not when you were born. He just didn't have the words. He didn't know how to say them. And I swore I would be different. I swore I would tell my son I loved him every single day. He paused, his eyes glistening. I failed at that promise. I became my father, despite everything. And I am so sorry. I understand, I said. And I did. Understanding didn't excuse what he had done. It didn't erase the years of pain and silence. But it helped me make sense of it. It helped me see my father not as a monster, but as a man who had been shaped by his own pain and his own limitations, a man who had failed in profound ways, but who was genuinely trying to make amends. That understanding was a gift, one I hadn't expected to receive when I got on that plane and flew to my hometown. I told him things I had never told anyone, not even Elena. I told him about the years of loneliness, about the nights I had spent in my tiny apartment wondering if I had made a mistake, about the moments when I had come so close to giving up that I could feel the pull of surrender like a physical force. I told him about Dr. Patel, the cardiologist who had become my mentor, the man who had stepped into the role of father figure when my own father had abandoned me. I told him about the first surgery I had ever performed, a routine appendectomy that had felt like the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of my life. I told him about the patients I had saved and the patients I had lost, about the weight of responsibility that came with holding someone's heart in your hands, about the joy and the grief and the profound sense of purpose that had defined my career. And I told him about the anger that had burned inside me for 12 years, the anger that had fueled my success, but also poisoned my happiness. I used to imagine this moment, I said, the moment when you would finally admit you were wrong. In my imagination, it always felt triumphant. I would stand over you, successful and vindicated, and you would have to acknowledge that I had made the right choice, that I had been right all along. But now that it's happening, it doesn't feel triumphant at all. It just feels sad. We lost 12 years, Dad. 12 years we can never get back. And for what? Because you were too proud to apologize and I was too proud to reach out first. We were both proud, my father said quietly. You got your stubbornness from me. It's a family trait, but it's also a family curse. And it's a curse we need to break. 6 months after the transplant, my father was well enough to travel. The doctors had cleared him, his new heart was functioning perfectly, and he was stronger than he had been in years. He came to our house for dinner, the first time he had ever set foot in my home. I picked him up at the airport myself, waiting at the arrivals gate with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. When he walked through the doors, a small suitcase in one hand and a cane in the other, I was struck by how different he looked. Not just healthier, though he was certainly that. Different in a deeper way. The hardness that had always been in his face, the tightness around his jaw, the guarded look in his eyes, it was gone now. In its place was something softer, something gentler, something that looked almost like peace. Elena had spent the entire day cooking, a massive feast of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables and homemade bread that filled the house with warmth and the smell of herbs and garlic. She had been nervous about meeting my father for the first time, though she tried not to show it. What if he doesn't like me? She had asked the night before, her brown eyes wide with anxiety. He's going to love you, I had assured her. You saved his son. How could he not love you? And I was right. The moment my father walked through the door and Elena greeted him with a warm smile and a gentle hug, I saw something shift in his expression. He looked at her the way he used to look at me when I was a child, before everything went wrong. With pride, with affection, with love. You must be Elena, he said, his voice gruff but warm. David has told me so much about you. Thank you for taking care of my son. Thank you for bringing him back to me. I didn't bring him back, Elena said, her eyes glistening. He brought himself back. He's the bravest man I've ever met. We sat around the dining room table, the three of us, and we ate and talked and laughed and argued about politics the way families do. It was ordinary. It was mundane. It was nothing special, just a simple dinner in a simple house with people who loved each other. And it was the most beautiful night of my life. Because for the first time in 12 years, I was sitting at a table with my father, and he was not my enemy. He was not my antagonist. He was not the man who had thrown me out into the rain. He was just my dad, and I was just his son, and we were together. After dinner, my father and I sat on the back porch, looking out at the garden Elena had planted. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and deep, velvety purple. The air was cool and crisp with the promise of autumn, and the first stars were just beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the vastness of the darkening sky. My father had a blanket over his knees, a concession to the chill that his recovering body still couldn't quite tolerate, and he was sipping a cup of decaffeinated tea that Elena had pressed into his hands before we went outside. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a worn envelope, creased and yellowed with age, its edges soft from years of handling. I've been carrying this around for 12 years. I wrote it the night after you left. I was going to send it to you, but I didn't know where you had gone. You had disappeared, and I had no way to find you. And by the time Margaret finally tracked down your address, years later, it felt too late. Too much time had passed. I convinced myself you wouldn't want to hear from me. But I kept the letter. I kept it all these years because I wanted you to know, even if I never got the chance to tell you in person, that I loved you and I was sorry. I opened the envelope with trembling hands and pulled out a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. My father's handwriting, cramped and uneven, filled the page. The letter was not long, just a few paragraphs, but every word hit me with the force of a physical blow. David, it began. I am writing this letter because I am a coward who cannot say these things to your face. I have never been good with words. I have never been good with feelings. These are failings I come by honestly, passed down from my own father, who never once told me he loved me. But they are failings nonetheless, and they have cost me my son. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. You wanting to be a doctor is not a betrayal. It is the most noble thing I have ever heard of. You want to spend your life saving others, healing the sick, making the world a better place. And instead of being proud of you, I was angry. Angry because you were not following my plan. Angry because you were becoming your own man instead of a copy of me. Angry because you were already, at 19 years old, a better man than I will ever be. I threw you out because I was scared. Scared of losing control. Scared of facing the fact that my son had outgrown me. Scared of being alone, which is exactly what my actions have ensured. I am sorry. I will always be sorry. I hope that one day you can forgive me. I hope that one day you will come home. I hope that one day I will have the courage to give you this letter. I love you, David. I have always loved you. And I am so proud of the man you are becoming. Dad. I read the letter 3 times, my vision blurring with tears by the final pass. Then I folded it carefully, with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic, and I put it back in the envelope. You never sent this, I said, my voice rough with emotion. I was too proud, my father said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice now, just a simple, honest acknowledgement of his own failings. And then I was too ashamed. And then so much time had passed that it felt impossible. Every year that went by made it harder. Every year, I told myself that this would be the year I reached out, and every year, I let my fear stop me. But I kept the letter. I kept it because it was the truest thing I had ever written, and I wanted you to have it someday. I looked at my father, sitting in the porch chair with a blanket over his knees and a cup of cooling tea in his hands. The sunset had faded now, the last traces of gold disappearing below the horizon, and the sky was deepening into a rich, dark blue. The stars were coming out in force, scattered across the vastness of the sky like diamonds on black velvet. My father's face was illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light, and I could see every line, every wrinkle, every mark that time and illness and regret had left on him. He was not the man who had thrown me out. That man was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the hardest possible lesson about the cost of pride and the value of love. I'm glad you didn't send it, I said finally. My father looked at me, confusion flickering in his eyes. Why? Because if you had sent it, I might have come home. And if I had come home, I might never have finished medical school. I might never have completed my residency. I might never have become the surgeon I am today. I paused, choosing my words carefully. The rejection you gave me, as painful as it was, became fuel. It became the thing that drove me forward when everything else was telling me to give up. Every time I wanted to quit, every time the exhaustion and the loneliness were too much, I thought about that night in the rain, and I used that memory to push myself harder. I became a doctor because of what you did, not in spite of it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. But that's not the only reason I'm glad you didn't send the letter. I'm glad because if you had sent it, we might have reconciled years ago. And if we had reconciled years ago, I might never have been in a position to save your life. Everything happened exactly the way it needed to happen. The pain, the anger, the years of silence. All of it led us here. All of it made us who we are. I'm not glad you threw me out. I'll never be glad about that. But I'm glad that we're here now. I'm glad that you're alive. I'm glad that we have a second chance. My father was silent for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he reached over and put his hand on my shoulder. His grip was still weak, still not the powerful grip of the man who had taught me to swing a hammer and build a fence and stand up for myself. But it was strong enough. It was enough. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "I've said that before, and I'll probably say it 100 more times before I die. But I want you to know that I'm grateful. Grateful for your forgiveness. Grateful for your help. Grateful that you're my son. You keep saying you don't deserve me," I replied, covering his hand with my own. "And maybe you're right. Maybe you don't. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here. What matters is that we're here, together, and we have something most people never get. A second chance. A real, honest, genuine second chance. Most estranged families never reconcile. Most fathers and sons who have the kind of fight we had never speak again. But we did. Against all the odds, we did. And I'm not going to waste that." The night deepened around us, the stars multiplying until the sky was thick with them. The sounds of the neighborhood faded, the distant hum of traffic, the barking of a dog a few streets away, the soft rustle of wind through the trees in our garden. My father and I sat in a comfortable silence, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, not awkward but peaceful. It was the silence of two people who had said everything that needed to be said, who had finally, after all the years and all the pain, found their way back to each other. In the months and years that followed, my father became a regular and beloved part of our lives. He moved to our city, buying a small apartment just a few miles from our house so he could be close to us. He came to dinner every Sunday, a standing invitation that he never missed. He attended my lectures at the hospital, sitting in the back row of the auditorium with a proud smile on his face, the same smile I remembered from my high school graduation, before everything had gone wrong. He taught Elena how to fish, a skill he had tried and failed to teach me when I was a boy. They would go to a lake outside the city on Saturday mornings, and they would come back in the afternoon with a cooler full of fish and stories about the ones that got away. And when our children were born, first our daughter Clara and then our son William, named after my father, he became a grandfather in every sense of the word. He was there for every birthday party, every school play, every scraped knee and lost tooth and bedtime story. He taught them how to build birdhouses and how to skip stones across the pond in the park and how to stand up for themselves when someone was being unkind. He told them stories about their father, about the man I had been before they were born, about the doctor who had saved lives and the son who had forgiven his father. And every time I saw him with my children, every time I watched him read them a story or push them on the swings or teach them how to hold a hammer, I felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. This was the father I had needed when I was a child. And even though he had come into my life late, even though there were years of pain and silence that could never be erased, he was here now. And that was what mattered. The cycle of rejection and disappointment that had been passed down through 3 generations of Marcus men ended with me. My children would never know what it felt like to be thrown out of their home. They would never know what it felt like to be told they were dead to their father. They would never know the years of silence and anger and grief that had defined so much of my life. They would grow up knowing they were loved, unconditionally and without reservation. They would know that their father was proud of them, no matter what path they chose. And they would pass that love on to their own children someday. That was my father's real legacy, not the business he had tried to force me into. Not the anger and the pride and the stubbornness. The real legacy was the lesson he had learned, the lesson he had passed on to me, the lesson I would pass on to my children. That love is stronger than pride. That forgiveness is possible, even when it seems impossible. That it's never too late to come home. On the 1-year anniversary of my father's transplant, we held a small celebration at our house. Elena cooked, as always, a feast that could have fed twice our number. My father brought a cake he had baked himself, a lopsided chocolate creation with uneven frosting and a slight lean to one side. It looked terrible, and it tasted wonderful, and it was the most perfect cake I had ever eaten. After dinner, we sat on the back porch, the same porch where my father had given me the letter, and we watched the sunset together, just the 3 of us, the way we had done so many times before. "Thank you," my father said quietly, his eyes on the horizon, "for coming when Margaret called. for saving my life, for giving me a second chance, for letting me be part of your family. You don't have to keep thanking me, I said. You're my father. That's what family does. We show up for each other, even when it's hard, even when it's been years, even when we're not sure we're ready. We show up. My father was silent for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the sunset. Then he said, very softly, I'm proud of you, David. Not just because you're a brilliant surgeon, not just because you've saved so many lives. I'm proud of you because you're a good man, a better man than I was, a better father than I was. You broke the cycle. You did what I couldn't do and what my father couldn't do before me. You learned from our mistakes instead of repeating them. I looked at my father, at the lines on his face and the gray in his hair and the peace in his eyes, and I felt a wave of love so strong it almost knocked the breath from my lungs. I learned from you, I said, not from the mistakes you made, from the way you owned up to them, from the way you apologized, from the way you spent the last year of your life, and every year since, trying to make things right. That took courage. That took strength. That took a kind of bravery that most people will never understand. Don't sell yourself short, Dad. You changed, and that's the hardest thing anyone can do. My father smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. It was the smile I remembered from my childhood, before the anger and the disappointment and the years of silence. It was the smile of the man who had taught me to ride a bike and build a treehouse and stand up to bullies on the playground. It was the smile of my father, the real father, the one who had been buried under layers of pride and stubbornness and fear, the one who had finally, after all these years, found his way back to the surface. We changed, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Together, you and me, against all the odds, against everything that was stacked against us, we changed. And I am so grateful for every moment, for every day, for every second of this second chance. The sun finished its descent below the horizon, the last traces of gold and rose fading into the deep blue of twilight. The first stars appeared, faint and far away, and the air grew cool and still around us. My father and I sat in the gathering darkness, side by side, and for the first time and longer than I could remember, I felt completely, utterly, profoundly at peace. The anger that had defined so much of my life was gone. The grief for the years we had lost was still there, but it was softer now, less sharp, no longer a wound but a scar. And in its place was something I had never expected to feel. Gratitude. For the journey that had brought us here. For the pain that had shaped us. For the love that had, in the end, proven stronger than everything else. I reached over and took my father's hand, the same hand that had once slammed a door in my face, the same hand that had written a letter he was too afraid to send, the same hand that had reached out to me in a hospital room and asked for forgiveness. It was a strong hand, still, despite everything. And it was the hand of my father, the only father I would ever have, the father I had almost lost and then found again. I love you, Dad, I said. I love you too, son, he replied. I always have. I always will. And we sat there together, father and son, watching the stars come out one by one, grateful for the second chance we had been given and determined never to waste a single moment of it.